Welcome to Norse Mythology, the unofficial guide. It's unofficial because I'm neither a credentialed academic nor a time-traveling medieval Norse pagan, but I deal with this material directly from the sources, interpreted through the lens of the experts and their opinions. If you're looking for depth and detail in a simple and accessible way, then you're in the right place.
Sigrunar skal du kunna, ef du vilt sigur hava, och rista åhjalt i hjors, summar av vetrumum, summar av albostum, och nevna tysvar ty. Victory runes you must cut if you want to have victory, and cut them on your sword hilt, some on the blade guards, some on the handle, and invoke Tyr twice. I struggled for a long time to figure out how to make an episode about runes entirely in audio format, without visual examples. Obviously, I won't be able to show you any examples of runes, and I'm not going to try and describe what every rune looks like. But this is a topic that's been coming up more and more frequently, and I felt like it was important to address. So let's see if I can figure out how to make this topic work. When most people hear the word runes, they probably translate that into something like Viking symbols in their minds. You may have seen someone with a Viking-looking tattoo, or maybe you even have one of these with little symbols all over it. Or you may have played video games or watched movies or TV shows about Vikings or Norse mythology and seen the same little angular-looking symbols carved into things like sword blades or magic stones or tattooed all over the characters. All of these little symbols are what most people think of as runes. And in many cases, yes, those are indeed runes. But it's important to realize that not every so-called Viking symbol is a rune. And by the same token, not every rune is a Viking symbol. A rune is basically any letter in a native Germanic alphabet. And remember, when we say the word Germanic, all we're talking about is a family of related languages that share certain similar features because they descend from a common ancestor language. In modern times, all surviving Germanic languages are written with the Latin alphabet, the basic ABCs. But before the Latin alphabet was adopted by Germanic-speaking people, their languages were written with different alphabets designed to suit their specific needs, and the letters contained in those Germanic alphabets are called runes. This is an important distinction to make between runes and other ancient symbols. If you can't use it as a letter for writing a word, it's not a rune. So, for example, you might have seen some fancy, popular circular shapes made with a bunch of intricate lines radiating outward from a point in the center. Or there's another popular symbol of 3 interlocking triangles that people use pretty frequently. None of these things are runes because they're not letters that stand for sounds. This means that runes are also not a library of symbols where a single symbol exists to represent every possible concept you can think of. For example, there's no rune for Odin and no rune for house. But there is an O rune and a TH rune and an I rune and an N rune. So if you want to represent Odin with runes, you would just put these runes together to spell a word, just like you would with the Latin alphabet in English. One difference between runes and Latin letters, though, is that whereas the Latin letters have unique names like A, B, and C that don't mean anything apart from indicating what sound is made by the letter, runes were named with words that had meanings, and that usually began with the sound indicated by the rune. So for example, the first letter in the oldest runic alphabet stands for the F sound, as in foxtrot, and it was called fehu, which you will probably notice starts with the F sound and literally means cattle. At the time this alphabet was in use, cattle were traded like currency and could signify a person's wealth, which made the idea of cattle and wealth kind of synonymous at the time. And one result of this is the modern English word fee, which is descended from the word fehu and still denotes having to make a payment even to this day. Because runes had names that meant things, a single rune could sometimes be used to stand in for its whole name. For example, in the same alphabet, the rune that stands for the sound D, as in delta, was called dagas, which means day. So every once in a while, we'll find an inscription where, rather than spelling out the full word for day, the carver will just drop in a single dagas rune to stand in for the whole word. This exact thing is found in a runic inscription called Östergötland 43, which was carved into a stone in Sweden around the year 850 AD, about half a century into the Viking Age. Using runes this way is called begriffsrunen, and it's a lot like sending someone a text message where, instead of writing out the word you with all 3 letters YOU,
a person can just type a single letter U because its name sounds exactly like the word U. Throughout history, there have actually been a bunch of runic alphabets. The oldest one is called the Elder Futhark, and all other runic alphabets are descended from it or evolutions based on it. The word Futhark comes from the sounds made by the first 6 letters in that alphabet, which are F, U, TH, which is considered a single sound, A, R, and K. And this is actually the runic alphabet most commonly used by popular media. My guess is that this is because a bunch of its letters look almost exactly like Latin letters. Fehu, which means F, looks almost exactly like a Latin F. Hagalaz, or H, looks almost exactly like an H. Rido, or R, looks almost exactly like an R, and there are a few others too. But where things start to go wrong is with the fact that the Elder Futhark is decidedly not the alphabet of the Norse people during the Viking Age. This confuses a lot of people because just about every piece of Viking-related media most people have ever seen is absolutely littered with Elder Futhark runes. But in reality, Elder Futhark was adopted by Germanic-speaking people somewhere right around year 1 AD, and potentially maybe even sometime before. In fact, as I record this, we're still waiting on official results on the dating, but there was a stone discovered in 2021 that currently looks like it may feature the earliest runic inscription ever recorded that we've found so far, and it seems to have been carved somewhere between 1 AD and 250 AD in Norway. But for any inscription archaeologists discover, it's a pretty safe bet that runes were actually in use for some amount of time before that specific inscription was carved. Up until this point in history, Germanic people had been speaking dialectical Proto-Germanic, the language that Old Norse, Old English, Old Saxon, Old High German, and all the others eventually descended from. And it was right around this same period when some of the characteristic features of different Germanic language branches were first starting to solidify. As a point of reference, the Norse period, or the Viking Age, doesn't begin until almost 800 AD, which is 600 to 800 years later than this. As Proto-Germanic broke off into different language branches and evolved over time, the Elder Futhark alphabet was adapted to fit new language contexts. Around the area of southern Jutland and down to the southwest along the coast, a modified version of this alphabet was developed that would eventually make its way to England during the Anglo-Saxon migrations. This new alphabet is usually called the Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Frisian Futhark, though some people prefer to say Futhorch, and it remained in use for writing Old English for a very long time, on down into the 11th century in fact, although instances later than the 7th century start to get rarer and rarer. In Scandinavia, Proto-Germanic evolved into Proto-Norse, and eventually into Old Norse, which is the language of the Viking Age, and the language most Norse mythology is recorded in. During the Proto-Norse period, Elder Futhark runes were still largely in use, but right around the year 550 or so, we start to see a transition from the Elder Futhark alphabet to the Younger Futhark alphabet. And by the time Proto-Norse essentially completes its evolution into Old Norse, which is also right around the time the Viking Age traditionally kicks off with the attack on Lindisfarne in 793, the transition from Elder Futhark to Younger Futhark is completed. There are some major differences between the Elder Futhark and the Younger Futhark. For example, the Elder Futhark has 24 runes, each of which stands for just one sound. But the Younger Futhark only has 16 runes, so many of them have to stand for multiple sounds. A few of the runes retained their original shapes, but many of them changed pretty drastically and continued to change as time went by. Okay, I keep talking about the runes' names. The way we know that runes had names at all is because Germanic-speaking people used poems to help them remember those names and to help them remember the order of the runes. And some of those poems have survived into modern times. Specifically, there's an Anglo-Saxon rune poem, which deals with the Futhark, as well as a Norwegian rune poem and an Icelandic rune poem that both deal with the Younger Futhark. But there is no surviving poem dealing with the Elder Futhark. So the way linguists have come up with the names of the Elder Futhark runes is by comparing the poems that do survive to each other in light of what we know about how sounds changed over time, in order to essentially reverse engineer their names. This is why sometimes you'll see different sources presenting their names slightly differently. Some of them can be more confidently reconstructed than others because there are places where the surviving poems agree with each other, and places where they disagree. The poems themselves look a whole lot like mnemonic devices designed to help people learn and remember the runes, as I said. But if we look a little closer at their content, we can also see clear evidence of some greater cultural or religious significance in them. For instance, the first rune, which Old Norse calls the and Old English calls feoch, is dealt with in a way that teaches conventional wisdom and reinforces societal expectations. Remember, this rune's name descends from Proto-Germanic fehu, which means cattle or wealth. In the Icelandic poem, we are told that, quote, "Fe frandarog og flatherviti og grafseids gata." Wealth is the strife of relatives and fire of the sea and the serpent's road. In the Norwegian poem, we get, quote, "Fe valder frandaroga, fydisk ulver I skoge." Wealth is the source of relative strife. A wolf lives in the forest. And lastly, in the Anglo-Saxon poem, we get, quote, "Feoch byth frover fyrir gewilchum, shel theach mana gewilch mitchlun hitdalen yif he willef od ritna domus leoten." Wealth is everyone's comfort, yet should a man bestow it freely if he wants to be judged well of his lord. So from the very first stanza, we're getting a few important points. Wealth is something to be careful with, because it's likely to cause problems within the family. There's also a social expectation to be generous with your wealth, especially if you want to be judged well by whoever is your own social superior. In the Scandinavian sources, this concept is also tied back to mythology. Fire of the sea is one of the most common poetic kennings for gold, and we're told in the Prose Edda that this is because Aegir's hall is lit up with gleaming gold instead of with fire, and Aegir, his wife and his daughters, are all very tightly associated with the sea. And if we're associating gold with the sea, well, the sea is where the world serpent Jormungandr lies, so we can also call gold the serpent's road. In the Norwegian version, we don't have references to fire and Jormungandr, but instead we get this obscure and seemingly random explanation that a wolf lives in the forest. This could theoretically be a reference to Fenrir, who is Jormungandr's brother, or just a fun rhyme, or a metaphor showing how being wealthy turns your jealous relatives into wolves ready to eat you, or all of the above. There's lots of other pagan religious stuff in there as well. For instance, there's a stanza about Thursar, and one about gods, and one in particular about the god Tyr. Whereas the Icelandic version of this stanza calls Tyr a one-handed god, the leftovers of the wolf, and a prince of temples, the Anglo-Saxon version refers to him as a star, or more specifically, as a never-failing sign in the sky, always above the night's gloom that holds good faith with noblemen. We could continue talking about when and where different variations on runic alphabets popped up over time and what all their names are, but this is a show about Norse mythology, and an episode about runes and magic in that context. So suffice it to say that the Elder Futhark, the Younger Futhark, and the Anglo-Frisian Futhork are not the only runic alphabets ever created, but any system of letters that descends from the Elder Futhark can be called runes. If it's not used for writing words, it's not a rune. And the Younger Futhark is the runic writing system of the Norse period, not the Elder Futhark, even though all kinds of people are going to be willing to sell you a bag of stones with Elder Futhark runes on them and claim they're for Norse rune casting. At this point, let's pause for a second because I want to be respectful. It's important to recognize two things here. One is that there's a difference between ancient beliefs and modern beliefs. There is no continuous tradition of Norse paganism or magical practices that began in the pagan period that is still being practiced today. All Norse-related religious and spiritual and magical practices that exist today only exist because people are trying to reconstruct concepts of the past with limited information and adapt them to modern times. The other thing to understand is that acknowledging this fact isn't meant to invalidate these forms of modern spirituality. If at some point you purchased a bag of stones with Elder Futhark runes carved on them under the belief that they were Viking divination stones, for example, learning that Elder Futhark was not the writing system of the Viking Age doesn't have to invalidate any of your experiences up to this point. Spirituality is a personal thing, and regardless what tools you use, whatever you get out of it will always be the result of what you personally put into it. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get to the big question on everyone's mind. Were runes considered to be magic by Norse society? And the answer is, what exactly is magic? These days, we're often taught that there are two separate interpretations of the world, natural and supernatural. On the one hand, we have things that we can break down and explain in terms of physics and chemistry and math. And on the other hand, we have things that can't be explained in these terms, such as deity, or psychic precognition, or influencing the world through your personal energy, or whatever it may be. And these two categories are often thought of as completely separate, alternative ways of explaining the world around us. A lot of people don't believe in the entire category of things we might consider to be supernatural, because they simply don't have to. Philosophically, they have another option where they can say that everything appearing to be supernatural can ultimately be explained in terms of natural phenomena. But imagine living in a world that didn't provide you with two competing philosophies. Imagine living in a world where religion and folklore are ingrained into basically everything you do on a daily basis. It's in your farming, it's in your medicine, it's in your food preparation techniques. And having the ability to explain how something works doesn't require you to file it into a new category of scientific phenomena that strips it of its associations with gods and powers beyond your ability to understand. In a context like this, is there anything that isn't magic? But then by the same token, if everything is magic, then is anything really magic? Runes, like so many other things in Norse society, have a myth surrounding their origin. In Havamal 80, which I'm going to smash together with stanzas 138 and 139, Odin tells us, quote, "That is now proved, what you asked of the runes of divine origin which the great gods made and the mighty sage colored. I know that I hung on a windswept tree, 9 long nights, wounded with a spear, dedicated to Odin, myself to myself, on that tree of which no man knows from where its roots run. With no bread did they refresh me, nor drink from a horn. Downwards I peered, I took up the runes, screaming I took them, then I fell back from there." End quote. It's a mysterious story that doesn't survive in any more detail than what we have here, but it shows us that the runes are at least numinous. In other words, their very existence suggests the involvement and the presence of deity. And the word rune itself comes from a root that means secret or mystery, which sounds sort of mystical to the modern ear. It's not hard to imagine that the emergence of the simple ability to preserve messages over time could have been seen as divinely powerful in a society where this had previously been impossible. And of course, if you haven't learned to read yet, then any written message at all amounts to a mysterious secret. Plus, from a more scientific angle, many of the runes bear striking similarities to their counterparts in other alphabets that were already in use at the time of the emergence of Elder Futhark. There is no academic consensus on a complete picture of how the runes came to be, but it is a very likely story of borrowing from and innovating on the letter forms of other pre-existing alphabets. But let's go with the mythical story for now. Despite having a divine origin, runes were not used exclusively for sacred writing, or even for pagan writing. The vast majority of carved runic inscriptions contain very mundane messages like, "I so-and-so carved these runes." There are also quite a few inscriptions on stone monuments, especially from Sweden, bearing Christian messaging and iconography, and inscriptions can even venture into the insulting and profane. One famous example is the Gamlebyen bone from Oslo that features the lovely phrase, "Oli is unwiped and takes it up the anus." And to be clear, I've actually softened the language a little bit there so I can avoid having to mark this episode as explicit. The point is, even though there is divine mythology surrounding the runes, they were also the alphabet of a people's language. So whatever it is they would have ever wanted to write, they would have written it with runes. But there are also lots of inscriptions that look like they contain a bunch of complete gibberish, at least at face value. One example is the Lindholm amulet, which is written in Elder Futhark and contains the following message, quote, "I, the Eralas, am called Sawilagaz, AAAAAAAAZZZNNNBMUTTT Alu," end quote. So when we see inscriptions like this, we can only guess that this isn't actually supposed to be a completely nonsensical string of letters, but that there is probably supposed to be some meaning here that's lost on us. We might be looking at a bunch of Begriffsrunen, for instance, where each of these letters is supposed to stand in for its name. But even then, what is God, 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 elk, 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 need, birch, man, ox, tear, ale supposed to mean? The easy conclusion to jump to is that it might be magic of some kind. But again, what does magic really mean in this context? Magic is a tricky word, even though I'm going to be using it a lot going forward. But it could very well be some kind of formula designed to catch the attention of the gods or affect some kind of ontological change in something. It's just sort of impossible to know with the information we have right now. If you do a quick search online for the meanings of the runes, you will come across all sorts of lists and charts telling you that this rune over here means love, and that one over there means energy or protection, or some such thing like that. But it's important to realize that historically, we have no evidence at all of individual runes being used to represent these sorts of concepts by pre-Christian people, or to produce any kind of so-called magical effect all on their own. Now, there's some nuance surrounding what I just said. I did not just say that runes were never used in association with things like protection. I said we have no attestations of individual runes being used to represent or affect these sorts of things. Some runes are named for divine concepts, like gods and Thorsar, but others are named for extremely ordinary things, like the L rune being named either lake or leak, and the E rune being named horse. Whereas in some modern spiritual movements, the Elder Futhark U rune, which is named for the wild ox, is said to be a symbol of strength and perseverance and hard work. We have absolutely no evidence at all that this rune would have been used to mean those same things in ancient times. In fact, there is good evidence that we are culturally different enough from ancient people in our time that the associations we make with the names of the runes are not anything like the associations that they would have made with the same words. I'll come back to this in a little bit. For now, let's get into a few examples of real attestations of what might be called rune magic. These come from both the literary record and from archaeology. First, let's touch on things like divining. As it turns out, some sort of casting or divining is repeatedly attested in the ancient record. One of the earliest records comes from the Roman author Tacitus, who I've mentioned before, and who wrote about Germanic-speaking people back in the 1st century. Tacitus notes that, quote, "To the use of lots and auguries they are addicted beyond all other nations. Their method of divination by lots is exceedingly simple. From a tree which bears fruit they cut a twig, and divide it into 2 small pieces. These they distinguish by so many several marks, and throw them at random and without order upon a white garment. Then the priest of the community, if for the public the lots are consulted, or the father of a family, if about a private concern, after he has solemnly invoked the gods, with eyes lifted up to heaven, takes up every piece thrice, and having done thus, forms a judgment according to the marks before made." End quote. I should point out that Tacitus does not actually say that these several marks carved on the bits of wood are runes. They might be, but if we consider that Tacitus is writing right around the same time as our earliest runic inscriptions, and if we imagine that this practice of divining had already been around for a long time at this point, it's also possible that these several marks could have been symbols that predate the introduction of runes. Honestly, what seems to be just as important as the marks themselves is the fact that they are carved on wood from a fruit-bearing tree. No matter where we turn, we can't get away from the tremendous importance of trees in the ancient Germanic record. And in fact, this idea of wood-based divining shows up again and again. Another example comes from the poem Himmiskvida, when the gods decide that they need to start having feasts at Aegir's Hall. Aegir's Hall is chosen by some process where the gods, quote, shook the twigs and looked at the augury. We don't have any more details on how that process works, or whether it involves runes. But again, there's twigs, which of course come from trees. We also have a mention in Voluspa, where the poem is describing conditions after Ragnarok, and we are told that, quote, Hunir will choose a wooden slip for prophecy, end quote. Again, we have wood-based divining, but no actual mention of runes. And if we take that in light of what Tacitus told us about whose responsibility it is to do the divining, maybe this is meant to tell us something about Hunir taking up either a priestly or fatherly role for the remaining gods in the New Age. Either way, this is the type of information we have available to us about divination from the ancient Germanic record.
And what this means is that there are no modern guides to rune casting that are teaching you anything about how divination worked in the pre-Christian period. That's not a statement about the spiritual validity of modern practices, just a point about knowing the difference between what's ancient and what's modern. But even though runes are pretty ambiguous to what we know about divination, there are plenty of what we'll call magic spells in the record that absolutely require runes. What you'll probably start to notice right off the bat is that in every single one of these spells, the runes themselves are never enough to create the magic all on their own. They are always part of a larger magical formula involving multiple components. What is probably one of the largest collections of rune spells we have comes from the poem Sigurdrifamal, where the hero Sigurður, who I keep promising to do an episode on at some point, has just rescued a Valkyrie, named either Brynhildr or Sigurdrifa, depending on the poem, from a magical sleep curse placed upon her by Odin because she brought down the wrong man in battle. Right out of the gate, Sigurdrifa tells us that, quote, Odin brought it about that I could not break the sleep runes, end quote. And then she offers Sigurður a beer, which she claims to have enchanted with, quote, good charms and runes of pleasure, end quote. But after this, she then goes on to enumerate 8 separate rune spells which Sigurður ought to learn for his own benefit. One of those I recited at the beginning of this episode, and I'll recite it again now. It comes from stanza 6, and I'll follow it up with another one from stanza 10. Quote, victory runes you must cut if you want to have victory, and cut them on your sword hilt, some on the blade guards, some on the handle, and invoke Tyr twice. Sea runes you must cut if you want to have guaranteed the sail horses on the sea. On the prow they must be cut, and on the rudder, and burnt into the oar with fire. However steep the breakers or dark the waves, yet you'll come home safe from the sea, end quote. They're all sort of like this. There are certain runes, in this case victory runes and sea runes, which have to be inscribed on certain things in certain ways. There is no single rune named victory or sea. So either victory runes must mean the actual word victory spelled out, or it could be some sequence of runes the Norse associated with victory that we just don't understand. In order to effect victory, these runes have to be carved in certain places on a sword, and the god Tyr specifically has to be named twice. To be safe at sea, the sea runes have to be cut on the prow and the rudder of a ship, but burned into the oar with fire. It's never a process whereby we can just wear a necklace with a single fey rune on it to start attracting wealth, for example. There's always a particular magical formula that has to be followed for the magic to take effect. Sigurdrifa seems to confirm this in stanza 19, where she mentions that all these runes must be used, quote, without confusing them, end quote. Now, sometimes runes need to be both cut and colored. Near the end of the poem Havamal, Odin is explaining a few magic spells he's learned along the way, and some of these explicitly involve runes. In stanza 157, he says, quote, I know a 12th one. If I see up in a tree a dangling corpse in a noose, I can so carve and color the runes that the man walks and talks with me, end quote. Releasing the innate power of a runic inscription by painting it is a concept that shows up again in Egil's saga, when Egil is given a poisoned drink, but he neutralizes the poison by cutting runes on his drinking horn and painting them with blood from his own hand. But getting back to necromancy and, surprise, surprise, wood, Saxo tells a story in his Gesta Danorum about the hero Haringus and his Jotun wife Hearthgripa, who find themselves staying the night with a family who are in the middle of performing funeral rites for a recently deceased head of the household. Hearthgripa carves some spells into a wooden slip and then tells Haringus to place the slip of wood under the corpse's tongue. When he does, the corpse is brought back to life and angrily curses Hearthgripa for having cast this spell. It's highly reminiscent of Odin's tendency to use his magic to revive dead seeresses, who are also usually not very happy with having been temporarily forced back into the land of the living. My guess at what might be the longest single rune spell we have recorded comes from the poem Skirnismal, which you may recall is the story about how Freyr traded his magic sword for marriage to a Jotun girl named Gerður with shiny arms. In that story, Freyr's servant Skirnir attempts to bribe Gerður into marrying Freyr, but when she refuses his bribes, he resorts to a curse.
I won't rehash the whole thing here because it's long, and because I already did that in episode 20, and also because I want to encourage you to read the sources for yourself. But I'll point out some of the highlights I touched on last time. Skirnir starts off by threatening to strike Gerther with what he calls a taming wand, which appears to be a magic stick that he got from a sap-rich tree in the forest. He then lays out his intentions for her suffering. He invokes a trio of gods' names, calls for the attention of various groups of supernatural beings, and then seals the whole thing in writing by carving runes related to the intentions he's laid out into the magic stick. Skirnir also explains that his curse can be undone by scratching out the runes that were carved into the stick. In this case, he tells us exactly which runes he carved to catalyze his curse. Specifically, he says, quote, "Thurs ristek there, ok thriestavi, ergi ok adi ok othola," end quote, which means, in my own translation, Thurs I carve for you, and 3 staves, lewdness and frenzy and unbearable distress. Now, Thurs is the name of the TH rune. However, there are no runes named Ergi, Athi, or Othala, so the poem leaves us to wonder what the actual runes Skirnir carved must have been. This same pattern shows up in a 14th century runic charm from Norway, but with that charm being so young, I'm hesitant to say it isn't just copied straight from Skirnismal as opposed to maybe being an extra piece of evidence pointing to some kind of pre-Christian cursing tradition in love magic. But speaking of archaeological finds, I want to talk a little bit about Sigtuna Amulet 1, which is a small copper rectangle with a runic charm written on it dated to the 11th century and found in Uppland, Sweden. Before I read you what it says, let's go back to when I mentioned that there's good evidence to believe we are culturally different enough from ancient people that the associations we make with the names of the runes may not be anything like the associations they would have made with the names of the runes. If you're familiar with modern guides to rune meanings, think to yourself what you've heard the I rune is supposed to mean. I did a search for myself and came up with the following modern meanings for Isaz: challenge, frustration, psychological blocks, standstills, clarity, rewards, introspection, and cosmic coherence. Some of these make sense right away, don't they? Isaz means ice, and ice is cold and frozen. So meanings conveying the idea of getting stuck make a lot of sense, right? I should mention that I couldn't find any freely available guides to Younger Futhark because everyone seems to think the Vikings used Elder Futhark runes. So these are all meanings that have been assigned to an Elder Futhark rune. Now, let me ask you which rune stands for protection. In my own search, there is a pretty common consensus that protection is the domain of the Algiz rune. This is the Z rune in Elder Futhark. Its name means elk, and it evolved into the Ir rune in Younger Futhark, which stood for a sound that ended up merging with R, and it means yew, as in the yew tree. Okay, now I'm going to read you the text of the Sigtuna Amulet in my own translation. Quote, "Thurs of sore fevers, lord of thirses, flee now, you are found. Have yourself 3 torments, wolf. Have yourself 9 needs, wolf. With these I runes, I, the wolf is appeased. Enjoy healing." End quote. What you may have noticed is that whereas modern systems tend to associate protection with the Z rune, and absolutely nobody associates protection with the I rune, that is exactly the rune we find being used in a protective capacity on a real pre-Christian amulet. The carver calls out the name of a thurs, who is deemed to be responsible for someone's poor physical affliction, and that thurs is warded away with a sequence of 3 I runes, thus allowing the person to begin healing. Why is ice associated with protection, defense, and healing? Nobody knows, but it's something we never would have guessed, as evidenced by the fact that absolutely nobody guessed it in their modern rune magic guides. As I mentioned a little while ago, we don't look at the world the same way our ancient ancestors did. And this makes it impossible for us to accurately reconstruct their religious practices with the limited knowledge that we have. Before we wrap up, let's talk about one final topic: bind runes. One of the most common questions I see asked in various forums online is, how do I make my own bind rune? Now, this question reveals a lot about the mindset of the person asking it. 1, they believe there are special rules for creating bind runes. 2, they believe runes are symbols instead of letters. And 3, They believe bind runes in particular are personal symbols and likely believe they are supposed to be magic or ethereal or something like that as well. I don't mind saying that I really don't like the way some of the concepts in the study of runes were named. Rather than calling the first runic alphabet something completely normal like the earlier Futhark, some genius decided to call it the Elder Futhark, which sounds mysterious and magical in English. And rather than using a completely normal name like combined runes, in this case, some genius decided to call them bind runes, which yet again sounds unnecessarily mysterious and magical. Historically, bind runes are a technique whereby you can save space in a runic carving by smashing two letters together into a single symbol. I'll try and describe for you a really common example. The Elder Futhark A rune looks a lot like our letter F, except that the two short horizontal lines at the top are just angled downward. The Z rune looks exactly like the dove's footprint inside the circle of a peace sign. Tons of words in Proto-Germanic and Proto-Norse end with the sequence AZ, Az. So what carvers will sometimes do is just combine them. They draw the dove's footprint with the toes at the bottom, and then add in two angled lines from the A rune at the top. And then boom, we have a single bind rune pronounced Az. We can see this exact thing on the Jarsberg stone, for example, where the Proto-Norse word harbanaz, which means raven, uses two bind runes. The AZ at the end has been combined just as I described, and the H and A at the beginning have been combined as well. It looks like an H rune with two extra angled lines sticking off the top right. Runes are letters used to spell words, and this includes bind runes. For this reason, you will almost never see a historical bind rune smashing together more than 2 or 3 letters. Any more than this, and the symbol quickly becomes unreadable, which defeats the whole purpose. Any complex line drawing you may have seen that superimposes multiple runes on top of each other to supposedly stand for a whole word is a modern invention in every case. What this means is that bind runes are only magical insofar as any inscription that includes them is intended to be magical. And the same goes for all runes. So, the next time someone offers to sell you a bag of Viking casting stones with Elder Futhark runes on them and a book teaching you how to craft your own magical bind runes, you can snobbishly turn your nose up at them and say, "Ha! Norse divination is always done with wood, never with stones, and these aren't even the right runes for the Viking Age. What's more, I prefer to paint my runes with blood from my own hand, thank you very much." Or you could think they're cool and buy them anyway, because spiritual fulfillment doesn't always have to follow historical accuracy to the letter. But whatever you do, don't forget to join me again next time, where I crush all your misconceptions about the Viking Age and make everything decidedly more boring on Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. Sources for this episode include Germania by Publius Cornelius Tacitus, 1st century. Gesta Danorum, translated by Karsten Friis-Jensen and Peter Fisher, 2015. Runes, Reading the Past by R.I. Page, 1987. Runic Amulets and Magic Objects by Mary MacLeod and Bernard Mees, 2006. Poetic Edda, translated by Carolyne Larrington, 2014, and the Prose Edda, translated by Anthony Faulkes, 1995.